Welcome to the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum for this online talk with Gareth Glover on the 52nd Regiment at Waterloo. This privately funded county military museum is all about telling stories which illustrate the impact of conflict on the county of Oxfordshire and its people. Gareth Glover, a former naval officer, is a widely published military historian, and his extensively researched new book on Waterloo is all about one of Oxfordshire's county regiments, the 52nd Regiment of Foot. I hope you enjoy the talk, and if you would like to donate to the museum, please click on the donate button. Thank you for supporting the museum.
Hello, I'm Gareth Glover. I'd like to talk to you today about the 52nd Regiment at Waterloo. Some bits you may know already, but I've actually done a lot of new research on the subject, and there are certainly a number of things that perhaps the regiment has tried to avoid mentioning for the last 200 years. Obviously, the 52nd Regiment was a very renowned regiment at that time. It had obviously been commanded by Sir John Moore, and at that time had become very popular with the Scots to join them, as he was a Glasgow man himself. But obviously he had died in 1809, and the next famous man that comes along is Sir John Colborne, who is involved with it in the Waterloo campaign, but actually only joins them a few weeks before the campaign starts, as he was actually working for the Prince of Orange until then. What I will mention very quickly is that the two battalions of the regiment were differently located at the start of the campaign. The 2nd Battalion, of only about 270 men, was actually sitting around in Ypres in Belgium, as having been in part of the sort of army that had been in that country for the last year or so, maintaining control of the borders there. Whereas the 1st Battalion had actually been sent to America and had actually tried to sail from Cork twice during the January and the February of 1815 to actually get involved in the war, which we know as the War of 1812 against the Americans. Luck has it that two horrendous storms drove them back into the harbour, and on the second time they returned, they actually find orders to actually go to Belgium as fast as possible because they've heard about Napoleon escaping from Elba, etc. Once they actually meet in April 1815, the two battalions are ordered to transfer the rank and file who are fit and able into the 1st Battalion to strengthen that battalion, and the 2nd Battalion is to go home to London. When the actual transfer happens, something strange does occur. We have 224 rank and file and a couple of sergeants, etc., transfer into the 1st Battalion, bolstering its numbers. However, over 284 rank and file and 26 sergeants transfer out of the 1st Battalion into the 2nd Battalion and go home. Now, this actually means that the transfers weakened the battalion by 80, not increased its numbers. And part of that appears to be a desire for many of these sergeants who have actually seen their time out, having seen out the war up to 1814, and a war weariness having set in, that their transfer allowed them to go home and actually leave the army, despite the fact that a new war was about to happen. I always put the analogy forward of you have to think of the Napoleonic Wars having gone on for the best part of 23 years. Many of those soldiers had well and truly seen enough of war. And if you want to put it in a modern analogy, it's like the Second World War ending and all the troops being told 3 months later they're off to Korea. You can imagine what people would have felt like, desperate to get out. And that's exactly what was the real truth at this time. Now, what did the 52nd do in the campaign? On the 15th of June, we have the Duke of Wellington finally getting notification that Napoleon has entered Belgium and invaded the country around about 6 to 7 o'clock that evening. And he puts out orders to get the troops to actually muster within their brigades, ready to actually march if necessary. For the 52nd, they were quite a way out beyond Ath, and their brigade was actually only got the information to start that mustering at 7 o'clock the following morning. That's a good 12 hours afterwards. That's how long it takes for a messenger to get there. General Clinton, who is actually controlling this whole 2nd Division in the area of Ath, gets a second message at 10 o'clock saying, you need to start marching to Enghien straight away. By 12 o'clock, he's getting nervous because Adams' brigade, which included the 52nd, are still haven't arrived because they're waiting for a battalion of the 95th to come all the way from the border to meet them before they can go forward. Clinton eventually has had enough and decides to march at 1 o'clock, and it's only 2 o'clock that this brigade finally arrives at Ath to find out that the rest of the division has already marched and they have to march after them to Enghien. On their way to Enghien, they managed to catch up just about, but they arrived there to find out the Clintons already had orders to move on to Braine-le-Comte. Once they actually march on to Braine-le-Comte, which is virtually without actually stopping, just having had a short break for a bit of biscuit and sort of some rum to keep them going, they arrive there finally at 11 o'clock at night, having set out at 7 in the morning. Now, you think they need a good rest. They get 3 hours, they're told. 3 hours to quickly grab some food and some rest if possible, and they're back on the road again because Clinton's already been told to get to Nivelles as soon as possible, and they arrive there at 7 in the morning. Now, while that has been happening, there's been a battle on the 16th at Quatre Bras and another at Ligny with the Prussians. But they are completely unaware of this, and they arrive at Nivelles to find the hospitals filled with Dutch wounded from the battle. And in fact, their orders are to march the following morning to Quatre Bras because Wellington at that stage doesn't know he's going to retire. He actually eventually sends another order which says, no, retire towards the crossroads where the two roads from Nivelles and from Quatre Bras meet at Mont Saint-Jean, which is about 4 miles south of Waterloo itself. They finally march off about 1 o'clock and slowly go up that road, the Nivelles road, up towards Mont Saint-Jean. They are there to actually protect the hundreds of wagons, the convoy wagons are there, of stores, etc., and all of the Dutch wounded that they found in these hospitals have to be sent up the road before them. And they tried to then stop the French cavalry from attacking them as they're doing so. They're not 100% successful in that around about 100 wagons get captured and taken away. At the same time, a number of men fall out. It's been a very difficult march. However, one happened to be a prisoner who actually managed to escape his guards and disappears for the time of the battle. And 2 others find a wine store and partake way too much. And one of them actually does turn up by the time of the Battle of Waterloo. The other fails to turn up, and a few others fall out. But when they get to Mont Saint-Jean, we then have to talk about what happened in the Battle of the 18th, when the Battle of Waterloo as we know it. Now, the first thing I will bring up is that there is complete confusion, and I have read every history on the regiment that has been published, and consistently people allocate officers to the wrong companies, and the companies are set up in the wrong order on the battlefield. And if you look at this screen here, without going into great detail, if you want to know about this in full detail, I actually did a podcast with the Waterloo Association on their channel for sort of explaining this for about 10 minutes because it's quite complicated. But basically on the black, you will actually see the names of the officers that commanded, and in brackets underneath it, the ones that should have commanded. As you can see at the top, Lieutenant Dawson is commanding Patrick Campbell's because Patrick Campbell was on leave and only had turned up at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the Battle of Waterloo. John Cross commanded Robert Campbell's. He was also on leave but never turned up. We don't know what happened to him. He just never arrived. Lieutenant Anderson, who was actually the adjutant, commanded Brownrigg's company. Why Brownrigg still had a company is a bit of a mystery because he'd already been sent out to Ceylon, as it was then, Sri Lanka today, and therefore why he still had a company attached, I don't know. And finally, Langton stood in for George Young, who was actually playing as ADC to General Adam. But if you look to the right, the white is actually the companies they actually commanded on the day. And if you looked at the first column there, you will actually see that the officers, in the order they commanded them, was completely different to what is understood. And I've read many a record, including one recently that came out saying that Anderson commanded number 10 company, which is totally wrong. He was in number 5, etc. Now, with regard to the other officers, you can see I can only allocate certain people to those companies. These are the ones I'm certain of. Most of the other officers, we have nothing to actually specifically state which company they were with. But if you look at the bottom, you can actually see how they would have lined up on the battlefield from number 1 on the right through to number 10. As you can see, Langton and Love, number 2 and number 3, have a question mark about them, basically because they commanded one or either of the companies, but I don't know which way round it was. And the same with Roman and Chalmers, who commanded 6 and 7. But we are certain about the others. Now, this is an important quote. General Henry Clinton was inspecting officer for the Belgian army before the Waterloo campaign started. And as you can see, his comment on the 52nd was not good. This was actually produced just after the 2 battalions had amalgamated, so there may be some excuses. However, he is very much saying that the regiment, lately the pattern of the English army, is now more the appearance of the remains of a good system than the present possession of one. That is quite damning. However, I will say General Clinton was very difficult to please. But you have to bear in mind that coming back from Spain in 1814, up to a third or a half actually went and left the regiment because it was the end of their time of service. You had the exchange with the other battalion. And in fact, the battalion is only about 800 strong once it actually has had the exchange. It gets another 200 odd men from England who have just come from the militia. So over 50% of the battalion, unquestionably, were not the men who had fought in Spain. And that's why you have to take this with a little bit of knowledge behind it. Now, we have records from all of these officers. On the top row, Sir John Colborne wrote a few times, although he wrote many years after the battle. Charles Rowan, Patrick Campbell wrote to Cyborne. Gawler famously put his foot in it and actually sort of made a claim for the 52nd in the 1830s and got roundly shot down for doing so. But William Yonge, who is related to Colborne, and William Leake, who is also related to Colborne, wrote later. William Leake, obviously famously with his record of the regiment, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Clinton and Adam obviously wrote their account, but we've recently found William Rowan's account in the Oxford Museum for the Soldier, Lieutenant John Hart's in the National Army Museum, and most importantly of all, Lieutenant Charles Holman's diary, which is actually in the Winchester Museum, but it was on show and therefore nobody had actually looked at it. And it's never been used for 200 years to actually decide if anything in there is important. And funny enough, it's the only diary that was written at the time of the battle. All of the others were written 20 and 30 years later with an awful lot of hindsight coming in. Now, this is William Leake's diagram of the 52nd marching out on its own, not even with the rest of its brigade, and defeating 10,000 guardsmen. As you can see, it actually is quite a claim and difficult to actually believe it happened in that way. And I'll explain why there are reasons to believe that it didn't happen that way. And you have to bear in mind, Leake wrote his history in 1860. He had spent his life talking to his family, which included Colborne and Yonge, etc., about what had happened, and he made many claims. And his claims specifically are all about the 52nd and nobody else. There's a perfect example out here. If you look, the 52nd are now just to the south of La Haye-Sainte and are crossing the road against the Guards. But where are the 71st? The 71st are right over to the right, and in fact the 95th are not to be seen, and everybody else is way away from the 52nd to do all the work of defeating the Guards. Now, when I have gone through all the records and looked at everybody's accounts, that is not fully what we get. And I will have to do this very, very briefly today. If you want further details, read the book. The division stays in reserve near Merbrain village for the great majority of the day. In fact, they stay there till about 4 o'clock. They then they take obviously very few casualties, the odd cannonball coming through. Between 4 and 4:30, they get marched forward. And in fact, they get marched forward to a very important position. They actually get set into squares from Hougoumont Orchard in an angle up the slope. And as you can see, with the 52nd forming 2 squares, because it's such a big battalion, you have the 71st, 1st 52nd in 2, 2nd 95th, and another one that gets forgotten is the 3rd 1st Guards, which is we now know as the Grenadier Guards, also come out onto that slope. What are they there for? All of the French cavalry attacks from 4 o'clock onwards are sweeping up that slope. These form islands in the middle of that slope, breaking up these attacks. Wellington puts them there specifically to break the sweeping cavalry charges up that hill. And you can see that's how they were done. The 3rd 95th you will see sitting behind. There were only 2 companies of the battalion here, and obviously they couldn't form square, so they just hung around the back of the squares and ran for cover when they needed to. But that is an important moment the 52nd were involved with within the actual brigade of Adam that they were working with. But let's talk about the actual Guard situation. It is clear from the evidence, if you read all of the French accounts, all of the British accounts, that's from the Guards, everybody else is interested, and obviously Adam's brigade and anybody else has got a comment to make, that the Guard attack was not one big 10,000 men in a column. In fact, it couldn't have been because there was only 5,000 to 6,000 men available to attack in the first place. What they did, and Napoleon on this occasion even himself admits it, and he wouldn't admit it normally because it is a criticism of him, because he admits that the chasseurs were ready first, so he orders the battalions of the chasseurs to attack first and not to wait for the other guard to get ready. And that's exactly what the British see, because the first attack they see is an attack of 4 battalions of the chasseurs attacking, and they attack the position around the point where the Guard are. Now, I will point out one thing on this plan, which is that this is where the Lion Mound stands today, and from here, running south to the Belle Alliance, is actually a ridge. And in fact, the land falls away towards La Haye-Sainte and then falls away to Hougoumont on both sides. So the chasseurs going up this side of that ridge and the Guards fighting on this side of the ridge cannot see what happens to their left on the other side of the plain. Now, the Guards do attack this first attack, and the chasseurs are defeated by the Guards virtually alone, possibly with a bit of help from some of Halkett's troops, but that's as much as we've known. But as you can see, a second attack is developing, a small one, of 2 battalions of grenadiers and another grenadier battalion following on behind as a reserve. This attack goes up the other side of that ridge, so they can't see it. And in fact, when that second attack moves forward, the first attack gets defeated and the actual Guards chase them away. That is happening at virtually the same time that the other 2 grenadier battalions arrive at the crest. Now, and because of that, they don't know anything of this is happening. On this side at the time, Cruz and Detmer's troops arrive, which are Chass's troops, which have come all the way across the battlefield, ordered by Wellington to arrive and save the day. Because in fact, the whole of this front here between Halkett and the KGL on the crossroads has virtually collapsed with the Guard arriving. And most of the units that should have been there are already on their way back to the north, heading off the battlefield. So these Dutch-Belgian troops do claim, and have every right to claim, that they eventually turned this attack away, which then falls away towards La Belle Alliance. Now, you're thinking, well, if that's all happened, what's the 52nd got to do with all this? Well, there were 3 other battalions sitting just off the edge of Hougoumont Wood as a reserve. And these battalions, including two chasseurs battalions, including the one with Cambron in it, were sitting there, and they actually see the defeat of these chasseurs, and they start moving forward. Now, some of the French claim they were only doing it to protect the French as they retired. Others say, no, this was another attack. But as they move forward, they forced the guards to turn round and run back towards our British guards to run back up towards the crest of the ridge because there was a new attack coming, which is exactly what they admit to. And then this is the column of 3 battalions that, in fact, that the 52nd and, in fact, all of Adams' brigade now look upon as something they have to deal with because it's coming in from further to the west. One thing I will say is there's a lot of arguments about whether the Guards defeated the Chasseurs or the Grenadiers. As you can see, both look quite similar. They both wore a blue coat for a start with, which is actually different to the line infantry that wore grey. And obviously they wore a lot of red, there's a tiny bit of green in them, and in fact the main difference for the Grenadier on the left is actually a brass plate on his head. But I have to say, when I've seen versions of this in the museums, etc., half of the brass plate is actually hidden by the hair of the actual busby. And I would say at 100 to 150 yards in a smoke-filled battlefield with everything that's going on, I think it's very easy to mistake them. And that's why I think there's all this discussion about who defeated the actual Grenadiers, should we say, of this attack. In fact, it certainly wasn't the British Guards because they were all chasseurs they dealt with. As I said now, the brigade swings out and swings through 90 degrees and actually turns onto the flank of this advancing column. The 52nd do it. Colborne says, I did it without any orders at all. I did it. General Adam comes up and says, what are you up to? And he says what he's planning to do, and Adam says, go on. General Clinton is also there. General Clinton sees it, and what he does is he goes off and rides to his other brigades and orders them to follow it up, to help out the Adams Brigade. General Hill is there, but General Hill actually has his horse shot and disappears for a short while. But the most important person is there is Wellington himself. He is on the ridge behind the 2nd 95th, and even Colborne himself admits that a messenger was sent from Wellington ordering the flank movement that he actually carried out, literally a minute or two after he actually ordered it himself. So one of the points I'll make is that, some people say, well, Wellington claims that he did it or he ignored the movement because he didn't order it. I actually think in the actual confusion of it all, Wellington had already obviously ordered exactly what Colborne did and probably thought that he was actually acting on his orders, because with all the confusion that was there, it would have been literally a minute or two difference between it happening. So this swing onto the side of the actual guard ends up with them actually then charging the guard without really opening fire. They actually only opened fire from about 2 companies while they're forming, and then once they're round, Colborne sends them in with a bayonet straight away. The Imperial Guard, however, actually fired, and about 150 of them got killed or wounded at this moment. But one of the things you'll notice is that just to their left of the 52nd is the 2nd 95th. Now, they're turning on the same axis with the brigade, and therefore were virtually there immediately. The 71st and the 3rd 95th were a bit later in coming because they had a lot further to swing around to actually join. But they do join, and as they cross the battlefield after the Guard give way, they actually do join them, and they've actually joined together as a brigade before they've crossed the battlefield. So whereas Leake shows 71st going off somewhere completely different, which would make no sense if you're trying to command that brigade, that didn't happen. They all moved together. Now, it's slightly confusing this, but I'll try and explain this. You have Detmer's troops pushing the Grenadiers that is actually defeated through the actual Orchard of Plaisance. You've actually got the Adams Brigade crossing the road near the intermediate ridge on the battlefield before it travels towards the south and driving the French off. And then that allows room for Vivian's and Vandeleur's cavalry to charge across the battlefield, as you can see, and decimate the last of the squares on that side of the battlefield and basically break the French will to continue. Now, This explains what happens in some detail when they arrive near La Belle Alliance, which is here, the farm of La Belle Alliance. You have the French front line here, and as you can see, the brigade actually crosses the line here and finds many abandoned artillery here. The cavalry obviously charged on this side. Now, when they pass there, they come to a lane which is actually quite famous for the point where they actually overrun an artillery battery that was trying to escape. And there is a very nice painting of that, which is that one there, except I will say that from that position, you cannot see Plancenoit Church, so the spire in the background is an artistic license, should we say. But that's the 52nd overrunning the battalion in the lane, and that is actually the lane today that actually happened in. It still exists, and it actually goes up. If you carry on up the top there, you come to the main Chaussee, the main road from sort of going through to Brussels, and you can cross it there. And actually, that's the point at where the Wounded Eagle monument is. But this side of the track is quite hidden. It's actually got a lot covered with bushes, etc. But it still exists, and that's the lane it happened in. They then continued to march south until they got just beyond Rosson Farm and actually stopped in this area here, just by the hamlet of Maison Drouot. Now, I find one thing that's very interesting about this point is that it's only when they arrive there, around about 9:15 in the evening, they settle for the evening, they're trying to actually find some food and water, etc. And it's a good half hour, according to Leake. And obviously, I always take Leake with a bit of a doubt, because, of course, he wrote it so late. Good a half hour before the Prussians finally arrive from Plancenoit. And they arrive on this road that comes in from Plancenoit here. It wouldn't make any sense for them to go towards the Belle Alliance, because Plancenoit is down here. They're better off going into the rear of what was the French army at that stage, and this is where they move in. But Holman also says the Prussians didn't turn up for half an hour, and they didn't see them till 9:45. So that is starting to put some belief on the fact that when the Prussians finally drove the French out of Plancenoit, they must have spent some time reforming before they came anywhere near crossing the Chaussee and actually starting the actual the pursuit of the French off the battlefield. I will only mention this very briefly because it's in the book and it's obviously something you want to look at again. But this is actually the casualties by company. And you'll see that it is pretty even across the board, only ranging from 7 to 14%, depending on the different companies you're looking at. But it has some bearing on what I want to say in a minute, but say it's there if you want to look at that in detail. What it has an effect on is this. When the battalion moves across the battlefield, it is not in 2 deep line, it's in 4 deep line. But there is a problem, because Leake and Gawler claim that the battalion was formed into 4 deep line by putting the left wing behind the right wing. So as you can see, you end up with 1 to 5 across the front and 6 to 10 companies behind them in 2 deep lines, making 4 deep. However, both Colonel Colborne and Rowan said that's not what happened. We put half of each company behind each other, and we therefore maintained the 1 to 10 as we should do. Now, is there any way of proving that? One thing we can say is that, well, 2 things we can say actually that probably prove that Rowan and Colborne are right and Leake is wrong. And that is because we know that during the actual 90-degree move, Anderson's company, number 5, is moved out to become skirmishers. Now, you would not do that if number 5 was your pivot company, because that would completely mess up your pivot movement. So that would say Anderson was sent out because he was in the middle of the battalion, didn't have so much of a problem. The other reason I think is correct is because if you look at the battalion casualties, 6 and 7, for example, have more casualties than 1 and 2. So therefore, it would seem more likely that they actually did advance in the line as Colborne has suggested, because then they are in the front line as well. Otherwise, why do second line troops take more casualties than the troops in front of them? So that's one of the theories that has come out from this. I will mention one other thing, which is discipline. The 52nd in this campaign do not have a very good disciplinary record. They actually have a large number of problems. I've mentioned a couple. I didn't mention the fact that 4 men go missing during the Battle of Waterloo. We also have 19 men that fall out during the actual march to Paris. And you can actually see that Patrick Campbell has the majority of those, with 8 of them. So it indicates some sort of possibilities and some problems. And this is backed up by Henry Clinton when we get to Paris. Now, I've already said he's not the easiest man to work for, but as he says, the 52nd is seen to great disadvantage under Sir John Colborne, who knows nothing of manoeuvring. Now, that's interesting, seeing what he's famous for on the battlefield, and seems to hire himself upon gaining no information on or instruction by means of any superior officer. That means he doesn't listen to him. However, we know Clinton's difficult, but General Adam is also saying similar things. So if you look just at the bits in black, the number of court-martials, 90, held since my last report, is very considerable. In fact, in the year of 1815, they had 124 court-martials. And I can promise you that is about 5 times the average. He also says, Sir John Colborne governs his regiment with a firm hand, but has an inclination to deviate from established rule and a desire of independence from his superior officers. Another one saying it. And it's perhaps the cause why a sort of exclusive spirit exists in the battalion. Now, this exclusive spirit is actually not seen as a good thing. They actually think that the men think too much of themselves and don't follow orders too much. But the biggest one is Sir John Colborne is not a very expert drill. Now, that's 2 generals saying this now. Quite interesting. I won't go into this in great detail here, but you can read it in a complete sort of section in the book. But what I've done is, one of the ensigns, Charles Shaw, actually says that there was a problem with the regiment regarding discipline, and it was Colborne's fault. Now, I had to investigate this and see if I could prove it. And in fact, what I did is I looked at the number of incidents every year, how many court-martials there were, and who was in command. Because what Shaw says is that Colborne often didn't give the full punishment, or none of the punishment at all. He actually changed it and made it easier. And because of that, the men were not dissuaded from doing it again. Whereas Rowan, when he was in charge in Colborne's absence, always, if he gave the first couple of soldiers, got the full arm of the law and got every single punishment that was sent to them, every strap. By doing so, Shaw says, less soldiers did things wrong after that. Now, obviously, it's very difficult to prove exactly, but as you can see, in 1815, most of them are under Colborne in the second half of the year. But let's be fair, that is the year of everything, the march into Paris, the battle and everything else, so you have to take it with a pinch of salt. But in 1818, they also had 6 months of each. And in the first half of the year, Rowan only saw 7 court-martials, of which he only actually remitted 2 of them. So 5 got their full just reward, should we say. Whereas in the second half of the year, it suddenly jumps up again to 26, with Colonel Colborne in charge again. And 22 of them are remitted. So there is some basis for what Shaw says. Whether that's really a good thing, and the fact that I guess we're not all particularly sure that using the lash was the best way of dealing with your soldiers, but clearly there is some evidence that the soldiers of those times actually kept to the rules more if the lash was used than if it wasn't. I would say, however, in this very brief conversation I've had with you, is that the 52nd did do a lot on that day, did deserve a lot of praise. Did they get all the praise they should have done? No. But was it a major sort of conspiracy theory to keep it away from them? No. I think if you actually read the records and actually look at all of the evidence is, unfortunately, they just got left out in all that went on. The Guards were given the credit by Parliament, effectively, and they got their information from Guardsmen, and they made the decision to give them the Grenadiers title. However, Wellington had this brigade march into Paris, and they were the only brigade to actually stay in Paris as his personal guard his headquarters. That was him saying, I recognise what you did in the battle. He had no ability to actually change what happened afterwards. But certainly it was a very good battalion, not as good as it had been in Spain, and certainly had some problems with discipline, but certainly still a very famous regiment, and it did well at Waterloo.
The question and answer session will start shortly. The Q&A window will open below the video window. Please log in or use the guest chat link to ask a question.
Gareth, hello, good evening. Notwithstanding the Six Nations match on Saturday, may I say to you, Durnoth Hapis Sant David, happy St. David's Day from our side of the border. You're in Cardiff, and I hope you appreciated what I said or could understand what I said.
Absolutely, and diolch yn fawr, as in, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the talk. I've got a question for you here. It's an anonymous question, actually, which has come in. And it's really about the state of the battalion at the start of the battle. I always feel that one of the most interesting things is to remind ourselves that the people who achieved these remarkable feats on occasions like this, and this was a remarkable occasion, if ever there was one, were people just like us. So they felt cold, difficulty, and they felt hunger and thirst and the rest of it just like us. What physical state was the battalion in by the morning of the battle? After a difficult approach march, quite a long distance, bad weather, and probably pretty meagre rations on the way.
You're quite right. As you say, you've mentioned the march. Well, as you say, that the between the 15th and the 16th, they'd virtually marched for 24 hours apart from a 3-hour break. They had arrived at Mont Saint-Jean around about 4:30, 5 o'clock on the 17th. And you'd think, okay, they had time to rest and recuperate that evening. But however, the weather was appalling. They would have been drowned rats the following morning because it literally didn't stop pouring with rain all night. They had no shelter, no tents. A few of them managed to find an old farm to hide in, but the majority got kicked out of that by some senior officers so they could actually have somewhere to stay for the night. And basically, food-wise, the wagons had failed to get through. But however, on the food, the battalion and obviously the regiment itself fared a little bit better than many because Tupper Carey, who was their supply officer, actually managed to find a wagon that couldn't find its home, as is his home regiment, and actually commandeered the sort of biscuit and food they had on board that morning. So most of them managed to get a feed, but was certainly soaked through, miserable, and had a terrible time of it for the last 48 hours.
So they were pretty uncomfortable, and it would have been difficult to get their act together the following day, but they did it okay.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think like every other unit, you have to say, you know, every unit there had gone through the mill for that 48-hour period and still managed to get themselves organised and ready for battle when it came.
One of the questions which occurs to me is that the casualties, and I know there were about 200 casualties in the regiment. Most of them would have been injured rather than killed, about 50 killed, I think, about 200 altogether who were casualties that day. We rather think that the battlefield at the end of it all was in a terrible state, that there were wounded and dying men all over the place. Some of these men were even being robbed as they lay incapable or incapacitated by their wounds. What kind of medical support, what sort of first aid medical support was there in an infantry unit like this?
Right, well, the average battalion had 2 surgeons with it, a surgeon and an assistant surgeon on the battlefield. The assistant surgeon would often be very close to the actual battalion, within 100 yards in the rear or something like that, in some hopefully slightly safer position than the battalion was standing in, where the soldiers would drop back and actually get their initial assessment and some treatment if it's possible. But clearly, with the numbers that were being right across the army, the numbers that were being wounded at times during the battle meant that a single surgeon is going to be overwhelmed rather quickly. The other surgeon at the moment was usually in a headquarters sort of hospital, which was actually at this stage the farm of Mont Saint-Jean. And in fact, a number of surgeons were there to actually carry out initial operations, which obviously included a lot of amputations, etc. When the actual movement of troops who couldn't get themselves off the battle really didn't happen until the following day at the earliest. I mean, there are stories of some of the French not taken off the battlefield, French wounded, until 3 and 4 days afterwards. But I think we assume that it was complete and utter chaos. But even by the 19th, the medical department had really started to come to life a bit. I mean, I have written a book with Mick Crumplin on this subject, and it's surprising how quickly things got organised. Wellington ordered a number of spring wagons he had at Brussels to come to the battlefield on the 19th, and the Belgian governor of the city actually ordered every coach and wagon that could be found in the city to go to the battlefield to start clearing the wounded off the battlefield. And in fact, within a couple of days, there was quite a good organisation going on with masses of buildings. Any large building in Brussels was turned into a hospital, etc. So although the treatment in the early stages was either poor if you were lucky, or diabolical if you're unlucky, it got remarkably better within a couple of days. And perhaps the most I think this is a surprising figure as such, because we know now, obviously, we expect good results from the hospitals in modern times, you say, in modern warfare. But okay, yes, a number died before they got to hospital, but of those that got to hospital, only 10% died. And 60% of those that got to hospital returned to the battalion to actually carry on as soldiers later in the war. And I think figures like that actually say something about the hospital system.
It does indeed, yes. We've got a question here, Gareth, from young Ted Pryke. I know who Ted Pryke is, and it's very nice to know that this young man is watching the show tonight. And his relates back to the question of really the 52nd on the morning of the battle, because he says, despite the weather, was the general morale of the 52nd good just before the battle?
That's a very good question. And the problem is you're always basing the majority of the evidence is obviously soldiers writing many years afterwards. And nobody writing about their regiment wants to admit that their regiment is not in a good condition at any time. But I think, like most soldiers, to be honest, I mean, if they can get a bit of food and drink inside them first thing in the morning to just give them some sustenance and get themselves around a warm fire so they're not as absolutely saturated as they were the night before, you do your morale picks up automatically. And there are signs that clearly, that, you know, like every battalion at the time, that soldiers' humour helps and everything else as well. So yeah, I think you can say that it perhaps wasn't at its best, but was not in a terrible position either. I mean, they had managed to get themselves into a position where they felt they could fight a battle.
Okay, thank you for that. Rob Yule's got a question here. Rob, good evening. Nice to hear from you. When the two battalions of the 52nd merged in April 1815, Gareth, why was Colborne picked as commanding officer over the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion?
Well, seniority first, and because obviously within the regiment he was the senior lieutenant colonel, but he was actually being attached to the Prince of Orange. But of course, once the Prince of Orange loses his role as head of the army in Belgium, which he had been until Wellington turned up, at that point Colborne's job becomes redundant, and he returns to the battalion and takes command. So basically, yeah, it's because of his seniority within the regiment.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. I've got a comment here from Alice Blakeway a few minutes ago, just to say thank you very much for an illuminating talk. And she's very interested in William Young, father of Charlotte, the author. I'm not quite, does that make sense to you?
Yes. The daughter was an author later in life, and also quite interestingly, which I have published in the memoirs book that is around at the moment, her account of her father's memories of war. She's actually recorded some incidents he actually mentioned.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Hope that answers that one for you. Dave Rushton, who is a volunteer at the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum in Woodstock, wants to know why Brownrigg is still being recorded as being present. It seems to have mystified you probably as much as it does Dave Rushton. Yeah, the only thing I would say is that later on, and it's a few years later, he comes back to the regiment, and it is quite possible that although he has been given a staff job out in Ceylon, he has been allowed to keep his company within the actual regiment, even though he's absent for 3 or 4 years. And that's the only likely answer that I can discover at the moment. But I've got nothing specific about that. But it looks as if he actually retains his position in the 52nd, although he's completely absent for years. This kind of thing must make life quite difficult for researchers like you. Sometimes it can be an absolute nightmare trying to work it out, I have to say. Robin Draper's come in with a question here. Can you say something about the quality and experience and performance of the 52nd's officers during the battle? Oh, that's interesting, yes. There is no reason to criticize it as such. I mean, you know, they all performed well, and many of them were very experienced officers. As I would say, once you get above the rank of ensign, many of the ensigns, Leake being a perfect example. I mean, Leake had been in the army for 6 weeks, literally 6 weeks. He hadn't even finished his basic training when he fought at the Battle of Waterloo. So, you know, there are some that really struggle to know really what they were supposed to be doing. I can only imagine Leake spent the whole battle with his colour sergeant prodding him where to go, because he probably wouldn't have a clue. But no, for the majority of officers, they did sort of command their regiment exceptionally well. There's no reason to think any different. There are no question marks over any of the officers. The only question marks there are, I guess, are over the ones that didn't turn up or didn't turn up till late in the day. Yeah. Okay. Martin Rigby. Good evening, Martin. Smarty, nice to hear from you. He's encouraged that the 52nd showed themselves to be of independent mind. And maybe they took their lead from Colborne in that. How different to the 95th were they, he wonders? That's a good question. And funny enough, what I would say is that, I mean, because I've mentioned particularly Clinton and his sort of inspection reports, etc. Well, he also did them of the 95th. Now, both regiments were famous from the Peninsular War, renowned regiments. But he doesn't have the same comment about the 95th, I would say. And I know we think that we're trying to sort of, you've got this whole thing of the universal soldier, the light infantryman being a universal soldier, can think for himself and do everything for himself. The problem you've got in some ways with the army of this period is generals didn't see that as a particularly good thing. Yes, if you're out in the skirmish line, but the 52nd did not fight at the Battle of Waterloo as skirmishers, and in fact they didn't fight the skirmishers for most of the actual Peninsular War. They generally fought as a battalion, as a line battalion, like every other battalion. And when you get to that position, at that time, individual thinking from soldiers was seen as a very dangerous thing. You know, when they were ordered to get into square rapidly because there's cavalry attacking, you don't want soldiers thinking, oh, I think I know better. And an example of how bad that is, Clinton said
that he was glad that the 52nd didn't get involved in any of the small sieges and to make assaults on French fortresses just after Waterloo, which happened a couple of times, because he actually said he wasn't convinced that the soldiers, when they actually broke into the fortresses, would have maintained the control that was necessary. So that's an example of Clinton saying that independent-minded soldiers at this period who are fighting as a line battalion, not as 95th individual soldiers or working in pairs only, is a bad thing. And that's how you've got to try and understand their thinking at the time.
Okay. At this point, Gareth, I'd like to say, at this point of the question time, I'd just like to say thanks very much indeed to you for sticking your head into the hornet's nest of this controversy, which has raged for a long time. And however many people you satisfy tonight, there will be others, I'm afraid, who probably won't be satisfied, and the controversy will go on, because that's the nature of the beast in some ways. You've done a tremendous amount of detailed research here, and I know that you've got, you'd like to thank the Royal Green Jackets Museum in Winchester particularly. I would say the preeminent military museum in the country, commemorating the 200th anniversary of Waterloo only 6 years ago. And also the Hampshire Record Office, because you've got a great deal of help from them. And from our point of view in the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum, we've got a great deal of hope from the Army Flying Museum and Heidi Borden Video on the production of this story tonight. I've been asked to mention that we need to open the Q&A window as there is a problem of some sort with the web page, and not many questions are getting through. Is that about right?
No, you need to click on, there's a 3-dot icon at the top of the chat window. They need to click on the 3-dot icon, and that will open, and select pop-outs, and that will open the window.
At the top of your Q&A window, there's a 3-dot icon. You need to click on that
and select pop-out.
And select pop-out. Good luck. Let's hope we get that. Robert Yule's come in with another question. When the commanding officer ordered the wheel into the flank of the chasseur of the Guard Imperial, Adam agreed and ordered the brigades to conform. That is exactly what you said, I think, isn't it?
Yes, he obviously asked the question of why he was doing it. But as I said, the other thing that's a little bit different is that Colborne actually admits in a couple of letters that he then receives the order from Wellington to do exactly the same thing a couple of minutes later. So there's lots of people thinking about doing the same manoeuvre at the same time. But Colborne is the one that actually does start it off.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you very much. Where were the 43rd in all this? I know they weren't at Waterloo.
Yeah, no, they were travelling over. They missed it by a few days and actually joined the army halfway on its way to Paris, and then got to Paris with them. So unfortunately, there were a number of regiments, funny enough, that actually arrived in Belgium but just didn't get to Waterloo in time. Otherwise, Wellington had quite a few more trips, which I'm sure he would have loved to have had.
I've got a question for you here, Gareth, from Jamie Geddes, who's a doctor himself. How many casualties did the battalion receive when they were in square? You talked about them being in square, in those two squares halfway up the hill, straddling, up the slope there towards the crest. Yes. From Hougoumont Farm. And the question is, how badly were they affected by artillery when they were in those squares?
Right, and the reason he's probably asking that is because he probably expected to be quite high. But there is quite an interesting thing there. Well, first of all, I'd say to you, obviously the 200 odd, because it's around about 210 altogether casualties, of non-officer casualties. Most of those, the battalion says, happened when they turned to actually attack the Guard, because the Guard actually did open fire on them, and they claimed that up to 150, and this is a consistent sort of figure, up to 150 of those casualties happened at that time. So that would indicate that not many happened at the time of the squares. And there is quite an interesting story about when those squares happened, because if you know Waterloo at all, it is very undulating and you can get little pockets of low-lying land. it seems by luck that the 252nd squares actually got themselves put into positions where they were not very well easily seen by the French artillery. And at one point, Wellington does send out an order, or an ADC, to say to them, if you're taking a pummeling, you can bring your troops back over the crest. This goes to Colborne, and Colborne says, no, you can say back to Lord Wellington that it's not a problem, we're not taking any casualties. Now, that's the 52nd. I've mentioned that you got the 2nd 95th to the left, and you got the 71st to the right. If you read the comments from those two regiments, they actually admit they were being pummeled to death. They were obviously clearly in a better line of sight for the artillery. And they moan like hell when they find out afterwards that Colborne has said this, the fact that they actually were deterred from going back because he didn't think they were under fire. Well, they were taking heavy numbers, casualties. So they were very happy to go back over the ridge when he did return at about 6 o'clock.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Andrew Pringle has come in with a question here about where the 52nd was when Wellington gave the order for the line on the ridge to advance. They were on the reverse slope to begin with, weren't they?
Yeah, all of the troops were initially on the reverse slope. And as you say, then when Colborne orders the movement forward, they come onto the forward slope. And obviously, when Wellington then, obviously having seen the Guard collapse, the 52nd are already on that forward slope, and they then cross the front of the British Army along the forward slope first of all, and then cross the Chaussee, the main Chaussee to Brussels, before they start turning towards La Belle Alliance. Okay, good. Thank you very much. Michael Riscall from Winchester wants to know about the casualties. And how they were disposed of. Those who died, how were they disposed of? Are they buried in war graves, effectively? The answer is, I'd like to say yes, but it's absolutely emphatic no. Apart from a few very senior officers who would get an individual burial, the great majority of both soldiers and junior officers would just be stripped completely, all their equipment and clothes ripped off them, and taken away to be sold or whatever. And they would literally be bundled into mass graves. Simple as that, at different points in the battlefield. After a few days, there is some talk in the odd sort of reminiscence of then them starting to burn bodies. But in fact, actually, the majority of the evidence is that the horses were burnt, obviously because there's a number of horses that were killed as well, or seriously wounded and had to be put down. Yeah. They were generally burnt. It wasn't generally the soldiers that were burnt on the battlefield. They were more often put into mass graves. So, and there were a number of mass graves across the battlefield. However, they don't appear to be there anymore, because we know that after the wars, within 10 to 20 years afterwards, most of these big graveyards, mass graves across Europe, the European battlefields, were actually excavated, and the bones turned into fertilizer for the land. Wow. That's quite a thought, isn't it? It is. Jeremy Archer from the Isle of Wight, a historian himself, has come in with a question about the size of the battalion, because it was very large. And you said that instead of forming one square on that slope, when they were trying to break up Ney's cavalry charges, they formed two squares. Yes. What are so they were larger than the normal battalion, weren't they? They were over 1,000 strong. What are the actual numbers? Do you have that? If I remember at the battle, they actually, if you actually take the numbers out that weren't on site at the battle, yeah, because you get some that were obviously sent to the rear on different functions, etc. It comes out at just under 1,000, about 990 odd, something like that. They're on the battlefield. Now, that they weren't officially the strongest battalion in Belgium. That was a couple of the battalions of the Guards, but they had actually taken large numbers of casualties at Quatre Bras 2 days earlier. So their numbers had actually fallen below the 52nd. So in fact, the 52nd was the largest British battalion at Waterloo, without question. And as I say, and there were many battalions there that had no more than 500, 600 men. So it makes sense in a sense, instead of having one large square being formed, for example, of 1,000 men, which would make a very nice target for artillerymen, 2 squares of 500 makes it less of a target, and also helps this thing of trying to act as almost like breakwaters, as I call it, where you actually then you break up these large, long lines of French cavalry that's charging the ridge.
You get a good feel for that, actually, from the diorama at Waterloo, don't you? Terrific.
Yes, you get a very good view
or panorama,
from the diorama
I should say,
of those long lines of cavalry. As you say, I mean, what you don't get there is there's no, obviously, because it's painted from the French angle, should we say. They don't really show the squares out on the forward slopes breaking those charges up.
I've got a question here from Neil, who asks you to say something about the 52nd's main recruiting areas at that time. And particularly, you mentioned the militia draft that joined them fairly late in the day before the campaign. Where did they come from?
Well, funny enough, the militia thing is that they came from county regiments, but the problem is county regiments didn't really mean anything in those days. Yes, they were the Oxfordshire infantry, but at the same time, they didn't get most of their men from Oxfordshire. If you actually look at the breakdown of the regiment, there's a good third of it was Irish. You'd have a good quarter of it was Scottish, because there had been a tradition from Sir John Moore's time, who was a good Glasgow man, that lots of Scots joined the regiment because of him and his fame. And in fact, there's a number of Scottish officers that hit that time. That had eased down a little bit after he obviously died. But recruiting areas itself doesn't mean anything either. It wasn't a case that they only recruited at Oxford. They would send recruiting parties to Ireland. They would be in Wales. They would be in Northern England. They would be in Scotland. They'd be everywhere. To be honest, anywhere they can get men. And the whole concept of the regiments having a regional sort of basis really doesn't stand up to the facts at that time. The actual soldiers came from everywhere and anywhere.
Exactly, yes, okay. Patrick Armand, I've got a question from him here, which says, in the diary that had not been read before now, that must be Holman's diary you're talking about.
Yes.
I noticed possibly Blennerhassett and Rowan.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a copy he can get hold of that?
Sorry, of you're talking about of Holman? Or of the
Blennerhassett and Rowan. Can I receive a copy? I don't think, without going to the Green Jacket Museum, he probably can't.
No. Well, as you say, there is a way of doing it, because all of them got published in this book last year.
Oh, yes.
They're all in there. And I know your museum is now selling them online, so you can get them from your museum shop.
Yeah.
But Blennerhassett didn't leave memoirs anywhere. Rowan did, both Rowans, because there's two brothers called Rowan. One wrote to Cyborn, and the other wrote his own sort of private sort of journal of time. So there is Rowan, but also Holman is in there as well, in complete form.
You mentioned Cyborn. Cyborn, of course, was the chap who was tasked with producing the official history, wasn't he?
Well, actually, no. What he did first of all is he actually produced an official model, which is now in the National Army Museum, of the Battle of Waterloo in model form. And there's a huge model in the National Army Museum he put together. But to produce that model and to try and get an idea of where all the units were and what they were doing at the time he picked, which is funny enough, at the time of the defeat of the Imperial Guard, he actually wrote to virtually every officer he could find that was still living in the UK. He wasn't so good at getting foreign people to answer, but he wrote to them and got lots of people to write back with their memories. Clearly, they are 15 to 20 years after the battle, and therefore they have to be taken with a little bit of sort of caution. But yes, he wrote basically a circular letter to all these officers and said, please tell me about it. He then did some other models. Eventually, in 1840, I think it was 1847, don't shoot me if I got that wrong by a year. He actually then published his history of the Battle of Waterloo based on all these letters, etc. But what we've done since in finding new evidence that he didn't have at that time, some of what he wrote then has now been clearly shown to be incorrect. But to be fair, he did the best he could with what he had.
Okay, that's very good. Thank you very much. Anthony Carslake, fellow Green Jacket, has come in with a question here, or as an observation really, about an article he's been translating from a French general, and you and I talked about that beforehand, who records that the Guard had driven in the question is incomplete, driven in the battalions, facing them on the eastern side of the Lion Mound, effectively now.
Yes. Well, that is true. I mean, I did mention that very briefly in the talk. Clearly, I could go into a lot more detail, but the talk was obviously of a limited time. But that's the area where the Grenadiers went forward. I call it the second attack. And that's where the units on the ridge at that stage were in a situation where they were starting to collapse, including British regiments. There are actually comments that some of Halkett's brigade was starting to be forced back. And it's then that the Dutch Belgians arrive, Chassis men, and they actually turn the tide again and drive them back. So there is some truth in the fact that that part of the line nearly collapsed.
Okay. So that was quite a success for the Guard until they were rebuffed by Cruz and Detmer when they arrived.
Yes, yeah. Actually,
okay.
Yeah, there's Detmer's particularly, but as I say, but yeah, certainly until those troops arrived. But that again, you have to see as something that Wellington had somehow managed to foresee, because those troops had been way out on the right wing of the British Army and had been ordered an hour before to move into that position. It's not just pure luck that they're there just at the right time to stop this major attack.
There are a couple of questions here, Gareth, which relate to the reporting, really, of the battle back in London.
Yes.
Alice Blakeway, who chipped in with an earlier question, said that Charlotte Young never forgave the Guards for stealing the 52nd's, her father's regiment's reputation. Well, that is a matter of opinion, of course, but Alex van Strabenzi, a fellow Green Jacket, says, did you say that Parliament gave credit to the Guards, not Wellington? He said he thought it was Wellington didn't mention the 52nd in his dispatches. And this is really the heart of the controversy, isn't it?
It's the heart of the controversy, but there's a number of things here I would say very quickly. Is the first thing is Wellington was renowned for writing terrible dispatches. Okay. And as the wars went on, it becomes very noticeable. He mentions less and less regiments individually. And in fact, there are many regiments at Waterloo. I'll give you an example. All of the cavalry that involved in D'Erlon's attack, destroying D'Erlon's attack on the right wing, actually are not mentioned at all. He only mentions the Guards regarding the defense of Hougoumont. He doesn't even mention the defense, the Guards defeating the Imperial Guard. In fact, he doesn't mention the Imperial Guard defeat in great detail at all. So when you look at what he sent to London, you wouldn't have got any answer at all. Now, the first thing we know is that Earl Bathurst, or Lord Bathurst, actually stood up in Parliament a few days later and actually starts talking about the Guards having beaten the Guards, okay, being involved in defeating the final attack.
Imperial Guard.
Yes. Now, where did he get that information from? Well, funny enough, we can actually trace it directly to his two sons, one of which was in the army and the other was actually just a civilian in Brussels at the time, who happened to write home immediately after the battle, and that information was in London before he actually stood up in Parliament. And lo and behold, one of those was in the First Foot Guards, which is what we now know as the Grenadier Guards, who actually say we defeated the Imperial Guard. Okay, so therefore you can see how those in Parliament got the message through Lord Bathurst. Okay, that the Guard had beaten the Guard. All right, no mention of the 52nd because his son's words in the 52nd. it's only a bit later as well, and you find out that the 52nd get dropped out, and the Grenadiers get their great sort of change of name and everything else. And that occurs because the Duke of York, obviously the Prince Regent's brother, actually commands the army. He's also colonel of the 1st Foot Guards. And he gets letters from his guards officers directly to him, sort of brown-nosing up to him, sort of saying about how well they've done in the battle. And I've come across a number of letters, including people like Stanhope, who actually say, we defeated the Imperial Guard, the old guard, we defeated the Grenadiers. And those letters went to the Duke of York. It's only just after that the Prince Regent announces that he believes that he wants to give the title of Grenadier Guards to the 1st Foot Guards because of the defeat of the Imperial Guard Grenadiers. And that does seem to have come from the letters to the Duke of York, his brother, not from Wellington.
Okay, thank you. Tom Hamilton Bailey's got a question here about equipment, really. You showed an image of the Guard Imperial in very stout greatcoats in the middle of June. They would have been quite hot, I think, on that day, but they had been rather lousy beforehand. The 52nd are generally shown wearing scarlet tunics. Did they have any topcoats, any more protection than that?
Wellington had the habit of actually trying to relieve soldiers of the weight of equipment they were carrying, because they carried a lot. I mean, at the end of the day, normal weight of the pack and everything else was over 60 pounds weight. So adding to that a blanket and a greatcoat added a lot of weight to that, particularly if they were wet. And Wellington had a habit in Spain, and he did it in in Belgium as well, is he actually said you can turn a blanket into a tent. That will give you protection from the rain, well, some protection. So therefore, don't carry greatcoats. So the British infantry in Belgium did not have their greatcoats with them. They'd actually handed them back into stores.
Yeah,
had a blanket which was designed to, they could wrap themselves in a blanket or put it up as a small tent by using a couple of muskets as pointers at the either end, and trying to put something together that way. But clearly, obviously, a woolen blanket will only hold so much water before it lets it through anyway.
Yeah, quite. Simon Pack here, General Simon Pack's come in with a question here, which is quite a good one towards the end of a question time, I think. At what stage in the battle did Napoleon realize the game was up?
Oh, well, unfortunately, he's never going to tell us exactly, and it's very difficult for us to know. I think realistically, if you look at the situation, at about 4:30, he knows the Prussians are seriously threatening his right rear with the attack on Plancenoit. Wellington is holding out, and his grand cavalry charges and D'Erlon's big attack have failed. And he, at that stage, I think he's starting to realize that his chances are low. But it's quite clear that Napoleon's character is always a case of, if there's a chance, I'll take it. And instead of thinking I'll withdraw to fight again, he goes for that final throw of the dice, hoping to get a double six. And that's what I describe as the old guard, or the older middle guard attack against Wellington's line. It's the thought of, if this final attack breaks Wellington and his army routes, I can probably deal with the Prussians. So there's still a chance of winning. So I don't think until the guard attack actually finished and failed that he realized he had no chance. Up until then, I think between 4:30 and about 8 o'clock, when that happened, I think he knew his chances were probably 90% against him, but he just wouldn't give up, and he gave that last chance.
And the rest is history. One final thought, actually. You mentioned the Lion Mound during your talk, and also the Wounded Eagle or the Broken Eagle statue, the French statue. what is the story behind particularly the Lion Mound? Because all of us who have been to Waterloo, as modern day tourists, if you like, battlefield visitors and so on, have seen it, and it dominates everything.
Yes. Well, the Lion Mound was ordered by the King of Belgium. It's said that it was actually put on the site of where the Prince of Orange, his son, who was at the battle, obviously, and got wounded in the shoulder, was wounded. That's not actually true. It was put on the flattest bit of land and the best place to put an actual mound, should we say, in the first place. It's obviously a central brick column, which holds the lion on the top. And then it was a mound fitted around it of earth that was taken off the battlefield to make it into the Lion Mound we know today. Obviously, that earth came off the battlefield, but there are lots of comments about where that earth came from. But it has been calculated exactly how much earth was taken off the battlefield. And if you look from the Lion Mound to the crossroads, where you can actually see there is an actual, the Gordon Monument is actually on what was the lie of the land at that end of the battlefield at that point. There is enough earth has been calculated between the Lion Mound and that road on the front slope that has been taken away to perfectly match what's on the actual around the mound. So they took it only from there. So the rest of the battlefield has not changed dramatically, as people say it's all changed everywhere. It hasn't. There's only that short area which has been taken away from the front of the Allied ridge. And two things I'd say on that is, one is that you say, well, then why does the battlefield look a little bit different to what it is? For the 200 years since, there has been intensive farming there. And in fact, they've got a real problem with soil erosion there. And in fact, it's actually estimated that 2 meters of earth has washed from the top of the ridges into the bottom of the valleys. So in fact, all the dips and things we see now in the surface are not as big as they would have been at the time. There's a full 2 meter differential at both ends that has leveled it out a bit. And the last thing I'd say on that is that there's always that comment of having seen the Lion Mound go up, and they'd obviously taken some stuff away from some earth from the line of the where the troops had been. That Wellington famously said, "They've ruined my battlefield." Well, he never said it. It was actually written by Victor Hugo in 1860, has no basis in fact at all, like much of the things that Victor Hugo said, because Victor Hugo is actually probably the worst culprit of all in history for engendering myths to do with the Battle of Waterloo. And that is just one of them.
Okay. There's an interesting question which has arisen from Kelvin. Some injured survivors became Chelsea pensioners.
Yes.
How did others qualify as outside pensioners living at home?
Well, obviously, there were a limited number of spaces at Chelsea, and therefore, obviously, I'd like to say it was the sort of the most needy that would get in. I'm lying. It would be the ones with the most influence, who had senior officers that would actually help to get their place in there, type thing. So obviously the majority couldn't get into there, and obviously they would actually return home. But there was a very organised system, both in the UK, the mainland, and in Ireland. Either Chelsea Hospital or Kilmainham in Ireland actually controlled the distribution of their pensions to them wherever they were in the country, and they got their pension pay wherever they were in the country. And some of them, because obviously those in the hospital slowly died out, were able to transfer into the hospital later in life if they wanted to do so. But it was a choice basically of people, and if they had the influence and the luck to get in.
Okay, I think talking about pensions makes me feel that it's probably as good a time as any to draw this to a close. Gareth, thank you very much indeed. And thank you very much to everybody who's been watching tonight, and everybody who saw the talk and remained with us for the question time. Thank you very much, everybody. If there are outstanding burning issues, please email them to us at the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum in Woodstock, and we'll do our level best to help you. We've got Gareth's book, which looks like this, on sale at the museum, and that's available now together with its companion, which is the 50-second eyewitness accounts at slightly greater price, £35, that one is. We've got other talks to follow from the museum, so I hope you will keep an eye open for those. And remember that to receive email notifications from the museum, please register your interest with us at the museum website and keep watching social media. Other than that, I think it's time to sign off tonight. Thank you very much again, Gareth and everybody else. And we'll look forward to meeting you again when we'll have another online talk from the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum in due course. Many thanks indeed, everybody. Good night.